On Thanksgiving Eve 1971, a smartly dressed man hijacked a Northwest Orient Airlines jet shortly after it took off from Portland, Oregon. He demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. When his demands were met, he released all the passengers and ordered the plane to head for Mexico with just the crew aboard. But somewhere over the southwest of Washington state, he and the money vanished into the night, never to be seen again. It's probably one of the most famous mysteries of the last 50 years. It's the only unsolved hijacking in the US, and a lot of what we're told about it is wrong. Now, I've gone back to the original FBI case files and found evidence that contradicts some of the most basic elements of the story and could suggest some amazing new possibilities. I'll be asking why much of the FBI's case seems to be built on false information, why they discounted some of the most likely suspects, and perhaps, most importantly, why they assumed the hijacker was working alone. So please fasten your seatbelts and make sure your tray tables are in the upright position as we take a fresh look at the case of Dan Cooper.
I read a consistently showed agreement. And Jeff O'Shaughnessy, a.k.a. Count.
It landed in Reno and he hasn't been seen.
I conducted a phone interview with Jeff to get a feel for his speaking rhythm.
The man who occupied this seat on that wet November afternoon was dressed as a businessman and looked to be in his mid-40s, though he seemed fit and athletic. In the words of stewardess Tina Mucklow, he appeared to be rather nice. He was calm and polite, cracking jokes with Mucklow, even while threatening to blow up and kill everyone aboard with a bomb in his briefcase. So calm that the other passengers had no idea they were even being hijacked, buying the captain's story that a minor technical issue meant they had to land in Seattle and switch planes. Once the passengers were safely offloaded, Cooper's plane was refueled and the money handed over. It was from a special ransom fund for just such emergencies, and the serial number of every bill had been recorded. The parachutes also arrived. According to the FBI, there was one modern steerable type of canopy, along with a more basic military type, and 2 reserve packs. In the rush, one of the reserve chutes supplied was a training pack and wouldn't have opened. Though Cooper didn't specify an exact flight plan for Mexico, he did give the pilots very specific instructions. They were to fly at exactly 100 knots, with the flaps down and the cabin depressurized, which indicates he had some experience of aircraft operations. He'd also chosen the right sort of jet to hijack. The Boeing 727 that was being used for Flight 305 that day had an air stair, a ramped rear staircase that made jumping out easier and safer than on most jets of the time. And sure enough, around 30 minutes after taking off again, the 4 remaining crew members, who the hijacker had ordered to stay in the cockpit, detected a change in cabin pressure and a bounce in the aircraft's trim. This they interpreted as the man opening the rear ramp and then leaping into the night. It was dark and wet, so no one could possibly have seen him. But radar operators had been tracking the flight, and with the information from the crew, were able to give the FBI a good idea of where the man jumped. An area south of the tiny town of Ariel, remote, rugged terrain surrounded by densely forested mountains. What followed was one of the largest manhunts ever undertaken, on land, water, and from the air. But there was no sign of Dan Cooper or the money, and only 2 bits of evidence conclusively linked to Cooper have ever been found in the area: a safety placard from the airliner's rear door and 3 bundles of the ransom money found buried on a riverbank nearly 10 years later. Proof, said some, that Cooper must have landed in water, and drowned. The FBI investigation, codenamed Norjack, continued on and off for 45 years. In that time, their files showed they looked into nearly 1,000 possible suspects, considered mountains of evidence, and hundreds of different theories, but never came up with an answer to what happened to D.B. Cooper or the money, in public anyway. And over the years, they did offer an official theory of sorts. Cooper hadn't requested an exact flight route, so wouldn't have known precisely where he was jumping. He was wearing a business suit, so didn't have the equipment or experience to survive a jump, or a likely hike out of a dense forest, let alone that jumping into a forested area at night was madness. And as well as choosing the less advanced of the two main chutes, which he couldn't steer, he took the dummy reserve chute. That, in turn, might mean he wasn't a trained skydiver or pilot, and had learned the very precise information he'd given the crew from work as a military cargo handler, or something similar. According to Special Agent Larry Carr, the last G-man to investigate the case, no experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night, in the rain, with a 200-mile-an-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky. He also missed that his reserve chute was only for training and had been sewn shut, something a skilled skydiver would have checked. And that's the basic story you still read in newspapers today. Cooper was an amateur chancer who probably didn't even get the parachute open and died on impact. Most likely he landed in a river, his body eventually being swept out to sea, along with the money. And it is true that the only notes from his haul that have been recovered were the few $1,000s found on the banks of the Columbia River. If Cooper had survived, why did no more of the notes appear in circulation? There was a handsome reward offered for any that were turned in. But evidence from the FBI's own files paints a different picture. The two crew members who'd spent most time with Cooper, Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner, were able to provide a detailed description of Cooper's appearance, clothing, and possessions, as listed on this FBI wanted poster. There, literally in black and white, it says that Cooper was carrying not just the case with the bomb in it, but also a paper sack. And not a small one, 12 inches by 14 by 4, the size of a hefty shopping bag. There's been very little discussion of the significance of that bag over the years, but files show that the FBI spotted the possibilities early on. It could easily have carried warmer clothes, boots, goggles, according to internal FBI memos, perhaps even a jumpsuit and helmet. So if the FBI knew at the time that Cooper may have had more equipment, why does Agent Carr still assume he jumped just wearing his suit? And what else was in the attaché case? The bomb was described as containing wires and red tubes or cylinders, plus a battery, and was dismissed as an obvious fake. But could other things have been in those tubes? Water, maps, survival rations? Was there a torch that battery could power? The case and bags weren't left on the plane, and no remains of them were ever found on the ground. So it's impossible to know. But it seems possible Cooper could have been a lot better equipped than many thought. Other FBI files shed new light on the parachutes too. In the first reports, they're described as two military types, and there's no suggestion that one of the reserves was a dummy pack. Much of that later information came from this man, Earl Cossey, who said he'd supplied them. But his story changed many times over the years, and further federal documents suggest that he might not have supplied all the chutes. Crew member Tina Mucklow also said Cooper seemed very confident with the parachutes and needed no help or explanation in using them. And the inferior model he chose to use was the same type used by naval pilots to eject. Probably a better choice for leaving a jet airliner than a civilian skydiving pack would be anyway. But despite the contradictions, Cossey became the FBI's go-to expert on parachutes. In 2008, a tattered military parachute was found buried near Amboy, right in the middle of the possible landing zone. But the FBI said it couldn't be Cooper's because Earl Cossey said it wasn't. Cossey was later found murdered in his home under mysterious circumstances. Whether his death is linked to the Norjack case is unknown, but at the very least, anything he said about it should be treated with suspicion. With the confusion, it's impossible to rule out that this might actually be Dan Cooper's parachute. The money recovered definitely was his. The bill serial numbers prove it. So the obvious conclusion is that the bag, with or without Cooper still attached to it, landed in the water and floated down to where it was found some 9 years later. But this contradicts another piece of the FBI's own evidence, the radar plot of the aircraft's flight. Unless the radar map is wildly inaccurate, the placing of local watercourses and rivers means there's no easy way the money could have naturally floated to where it was found, nor would they have survived so long in the open. So the map was wrong, right? Wrong. It was right. The placard from the air stair, the only bit of evidence conclusively linked to Cooper, was found right on the track that the FBI had been given, showing that the route predicted was most likely correct. Though it's been tested over and over again using different scenarios, the best guess is that the money was buried on the shore of the Columbia River through human interaction. So, not only could Cooper have been better equipped than the FBI stated, he may have been a better parachutist too. And taking the evidence of the money and maybe the buried chute, not to mention the lack of a body or any of the items he had with him, the balance of probability would say he could have survived. But what sort of a man could pull off a stunt like that and live? And why couldn't the FBI find him? Air America was a little-known airline operating mainly in Southeast Asia from the 1950s to the 1970s. It seemed a perfectly legitimate civilian operation, but it was actually run by the CIA. Over the years, countless clandestine operations were carried out, including covert missions during the Vietnam War, when supplies and agents were dropped by parachute, often at night, and into dense jungle. The plane of choice for these missions was the Boeing 727, the same aircraft from which Dan Cooper later jumped, at night, into a heavily forested wilderness. So instead of being an amateur with no experience, it's just as possible that Cooper was a trained and experienced Special Forces veteran. That his knowledge of the jet systems didn't come from work as a cargo handler, but because he'd made the same sort of jumps from the same sort of aircraft on operational missions. Once again, the FBI's original files actually support that idea. In their interviews, the pilots themselves remarked on Cooper's knowledge. He was even aware of things that they weren't, such as the fact that the operation of the rear air stair couldn't be overridden from the cockpit. And it seems the FBI might also have had evidence to show who he truly was. Just 5 months after Cooper's jump, a passenger on another 727 pulled off an almost identical hijack, threatening to blow up the planes unless he got 4 parachutes and $500,000. He also jumped from the rear stairs and survived. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy, a highly decorated veteran and skilled skydiver. He'd flown Special Forces helicopters in Vietnam. The similarities to Cooper's jump were incredible, but McCoy had an alibi. His wife and family all said he'd been with them that Thanksgiving, which seemed to convince the FBI he couldn't be Cooper. And it's true that none of the crew from Flight 305 recognised him. Also, McCoy didn't behave like Cooper. He was careless, less organised, and left too many clues. After landing, still dressed in his jumpsuit, he even stopped off at a burger joint while making his escape. and paid a teenager $5 from the ransom money to take him back into town. But there are so many details of the two crimes that do match, including some that hadn't been made public at the time of McCoy's own hijacking. If he wasn't actually Cooper himself, could McCoy have been involved in some other way, and knowing the plan had worked, decided to go freelance and carry out his own heist just months later? A dive through the FBI's files reveals some more interesting details. Far from being at home on the night of Cooper's jump, phone records seem to place McCoy in Las Vegas, and McCoy's wife eventually admitted she'd lied about him being with them. But his exact involvement in the Cooper case will never be known. McCoy was locked up for the hijacking he definitely did commit, but broke out of jail and died in a gunfight with law enforcement officers. His secret, if he had one, died with him. The official story is still that Cooper was a lone wolf, but that seems to be based on a belief that because he wouldn't have known exactly where he was going to land, no accomplices could have met him at the drop point. It certainly doesn't mean there weren't other people involved in the planning of the operation or the recovery of the money. And whoever Cooper was, eyewitnesses said he did seem to know the area, picking out the lights of Tacoma from the air and mentioning how far a local airbase was from SeaTac Airport. The expected drop zone isn't huge, so with local knowledge, why the assumption that he wouldn't be able to work out his location and get to a pre-arranged meeting point? Dwayne L. Weber is another name in the frame, a career criminal whose wife was convinced he was Cooper. He had military training, but little parachute experience, so perhaps he too was involved on the ground. As we've seen, the only bills identified from Cooper's haul with a few $1,000s found buried at a place called Tina Bar on the banks of the Columbia River, a place that Weber's wife claims he once took her to. And then there's Robert Rackstraw. Like McCoy, he was a military pilot and decorated Vietnam vet, and he also had special forces training, including extensive jump experience and a very colourful criminal record. Someone with exactly the personality and skills to pull off the Norjack heist. And does he remind you of anyone? So, could some of the suspects have been working together? Perhaps Rackstraw carried out the actual hijack. Somewhere at a pre-arranged location, maybe even Tina Bar itself, Weber was waiting to collect the money, which he took to McCoy in Vegas. Because if you want to make $200,000 disappear, where better than the casinos on the Strip, most of which were then run by the mafia. In the early 70s, even Jimmy Hoffa had a piece of the action. Cash the money for gambling chips and give the mob their cut, and you can forget about the serial numbers. So why were such likely suspects ignored by the FBI? In public, McCoy was said to be too young, but would you guess this guy is only in his 20s? They also said he was too good a skydiver to be Dan Cooper, which is pretty much the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And as we've seen, the FBI had more evidence that McCoy was lying about being at home. It seems they knew much more about Rackstraw too. Thomas Colbert, a well-known Cooper sleuth who assembled a team of ex-agents to re-examine the hijacking, felt that the FBI were deliberately blocking his searches, especially about Rackstraw. And Weber? He was ruled out because his DNA didn't match that from the one piece of evidence that Cooper left on the plane, a black J.C. Penney tie. A lot of people, including the FBI, got very excited about the tie. As well as DNA, specks of pure titanium were discovered. Whoever wore it, they said, must have been involved in specialist engineering, such as aircraft manufacture. But sources show at least 3 men's DNA was found on the tie. The particles of titanium could be from one of the previous wearers. For all we know, Cooper may have bought it from a thrift store on the morning of the heist to complete his businessman look. And if Weber was the man on the ground, of course his DNA wouldn't be on the tie anyway. There was much better DNA evidence recovered, a strand of hair and 8 cigarette butts that Cooper definitely smoked. So what happened to those? Apparently they were lost by, you guessed it, the FBI. There are at least half a dozen other men who could just as easily have planned and executed the hijacking. Special forces, troops, survivalists, pilots, yet most were also discounted, often because of the assumptions I've shown to be suspect. In fact, with so many mistakes and strange assumptions, so much actual evidence ignored or lost, prime suspects discounted, even though they had the means, motives and skills, it's almost as if the FBI didn't want to find Dan Cooper. But that's absurd, isn't it? At the time of the Norjack incident, the FBI was still ruled with a rod of iron by J. Edgar Hoover, as it had been for nearly 40 years. A hugely controversial figure, his infamous claim that there is no organised crime in America, basically giving a free pass to the mafia, has raised speculation that the mob had some kind of hold over him. Rumours were rife that Hoover was not just gay, but a porn addict who was also very fond of young men. In those days, any evidence to show those rumours were true would be a powerful tool for blackmail. Of course, it's all conjecture. Cooper might have been a loner who died on impact that dark night. Perhaps someone else found the money and laundered it in Vegas. Or perhaps it's still in the wilderness somewhere, rotting away. And whether McCoy, Rackstraw and Weber were involved, or it was some of the other 1,000 suspects, doesn't really matter to our story either. But if the mob did have a hand in the hijacking of Flight 305, or even just the laundering of the ransom money, is it possible someone high in the FBI was making sure the truth didn't emerge? And that even today, Hoover's successors are still too embarrassed to admit what really happened? According to Dr. James T. Reese, a former agent himself, who later worked with Thomas Colbert and said he had the door slammed on him by his former colleagues, Rule 1 was, you don't embarrass the Bureau. I could do 10 videos on the Dan Cooper case and still not cover everything. But what do you think? Could there have been a conspiracy, not just to carry out the hijack, but also to cover up who was really involved? Let me know in the comments. Be sure to check out these other mind-bending mysteries from our channel. And if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to make sure you see new stories first. Thanks for watching.